Okay, so we are going to start chapter 11, urinary system. So let's go ahead and get to work here. So the urinary system is a system that does a lot more than just getting rid of urine. It is involved in the saltwater balance, basically, of the body. It's a huge thing. Also, the homeostasis of your pH and also of your blood. And of course, excretion, basically taking metabolic waste that the body has accrued during all of its processes and getting rid of it. So these are basically byproducts of the cells, oftentimes nitrogenous waste. And then you discharge that waste in the form of urine out of your body. And so nitrogenous things like urea, creatinine, ammonium, and uric acid are the main types of waste that you have in your urine. Urea is typically derived from amino acid metabolism. So that's where you're building up urea oftentimes. And so this is where you get rid of most of your nitrogenous waste. Matter of fact, whenever you have nitrogenous waste, it's mostly coming from amino acids because amino acids have that amino group on them. And so if you break down amino acids, for instance, your liver will release ammonia, again, a nitrogen containing compound because of the breakdown of amino acids. This is actually quite toxic. So if this builds up in your bloodstream, it can cause a lot of problems. And so you have to get rid of that stuff. It's very water soluble though. That's a good thing. So you can just package that in with a bunch of water and just urinate it out. And then if you smash ammonia and CO2 together, then you get urea. So urea is basically the product of an ammonia and CO2 reaction. So uremia, which is a disorder, is essentially when you have high urea levels in your blood. And so this can be caused by a lot of different things. For instance, arrhythmia. If you're having arrhythmia, you're kind of fouling up your ability to transport blood throughout the body, therefore getting rid of your urea. Vomiting, for instance. Respiratory problems can cause that. And so these are some of the things that can occur. Excuse me, not it's so these are a list of the symptoms that are caused by uremia, not that they are causing uremia. This is uremia is if you obviously have an inability to eliminate the waste due to a breakdown at any point in the entire process. And it's a little bit of a process. So a breakdown anywhere along the process will create this backup, and then the backup will cause these symptoms. So when you take a look at some of the other metabolic waste, for instance, creatinine, this one is typically coming from creatine phosphate. It's an energy storage molecule. It's actually anaerobic in nature. So you'll burn creatine phosphate anaerobically in your body. That's when you're not breathing as well. You're not getting enough oxygen. Oftentimes this will happen in that first startup when we first begin working out and we don't have enough oxygen in our system to support our metabolic activities. And so some of these anaerobic molecules will kind of cover in the short term while we're waiting for our lungs to ramp up their oxygen in intake. Uric acid typically is coming from nucleotides. So nucleotides will obviously have nitrogen in them as well, right? Because they have nitrogenous bases in your DNA. And we'll talk more about that at the end of the semester. And so uric acid, unlike the others, has the ability to create crystals. That's because they're insoluble. And so if you have too much uric acid, they'll form crystals and then they'll lodge in the joints of different joints. And this is what creates gout. So it's when you have uric acid crystal buildup. And that's also, again, because you're not getting rid of this metabolite efficiently. And so that's typically a bad situation when you have those start to build up in your joints. Now let's take a look at its waste thing, right? That's kind of the stuff that most people probably identify with when they take a look at the urinary system. And so what does the urinary system do? But the water salt balance is probably the most important function actually of the kidneys itself. And this is really the key. This is the key function, the principal function of the kidneys. So typically your salts, mostly when we talk about salts, we talk about sodium chloride. These will basically be the influencers of directional water flow, right? Which is basically osmosis. So this is basically the flow of water in the body. And so the thing is, if you need intentional water flow, like for instance, if you need the water to go from one place to another, then you have to have the water to go, and you use the sodium chloride as a way to direct the water to move in a particular direction. So if you have salts, and it basically is predicated, and this is an important piece, because when you take a look at the kidneys, you have to understand osmosis. And osmosis is effectively defined as the diffusion of water. And so it's the flow or the movement of water throughout the body. Now, the important thing to understand is what motivates the water to flow is a mantra that we oftentimes use in biology and physiology to help us to sort of understand osmotic flow, and that is simply salt sucks. So that is to say that typically water chases salt. So if you want the water to go, say, from point A to point B, the water won't just go there by yelling at it, right? So you can't make the water do something it's not going to do. It's very stubborn that way. But the one thing you can do is, because you know that salt sucks and that water chases salt, if you basically create a very big salt pile over here, what's going to happen is the water is going to naturally flow and chase that salt. So you're going to effectively get the water to flow from A to B. And that's an important piece, an important component of how this water balance works. That's a very critical idea. So if you have more salts in the blood by the salt sucks mantra, that means the water is going to chase the salt into the blood, increasing your blood volume, which will also increase your blood pressure. Why? Because most of the blood pressure is due to water. It's a water pressure. So then that was kind of, I already kind of cheated ahead a little bit on this slide, but we use essentially the concentration of sodium to regulate blood pressure by manipulating the movement of water throughout the body. And so there's also other ions that the kidneys will maintain, for instance, the bicarbonate ion and the calcium ion as well. All of these will also have an osmotic type of an effect on water. They also, as part of the salt water balance, they also maintain acid base balance. For instance, your physiological pH, that is to say of your blood and of your body fluids, is about 7.4. Now, in order to maintain 7.4, the kidneys are constantly monitoring the pH. And if there's too much acidity, that is to say there's too much hydrogen ion, it'll excrete that hydrogen ion into the urine. And it'll reabsorb the bicarb, right? So the bicarb has a basic personality to it, and the hydrogen ion has an acidity to it. So generally speaking, you use your urine to essentially offload your hydrogen ion, thereby controlling and regulating your pH. This is the reason why urine comes in at typically around 6-ish or so on the pH scale. So it's a little bit acidic because of this. Now, urine, the kidneys will also secrete hormones as well. And so one of the most important hormones that it secretes is a hormone called renin. And so renin's job is ultimately, through a series of steps, to lead to the secretion of another steroid hormone called aldosterone. And aldosterone is a hormone that's produced by the adrenal glands, which sit on top of the kidneys. So if you take a look at the kidneys, you'll see here's a kidney here, and your adrenal gland is sitting right on top of the kidneys. And so the aldosterone will actually regulate this salt water balance. Why? How? Because it basically regulates your sodium levels. In particular, it essentially stimulates the retention of sodium in your blood. And of course, we already know from salt sucks that if you retain sodium in your blood, water is going to chase after it and it's going to go into your blood, increasing your blood pressure. The kidneys will also release another hormone, erythropoietin. This one is the hormone that's necessary to stimulate red blood cell production, but it typically is going to be happening in the bone marrow. So you're not going to get red blood cell production in the kidneys. It's only going to be happening in the bone marrow. A couple of other functions of the kidneys that we touched on. So they will also reabsorb nutrients that have gotten into the urine stream. So get those back, for instance. And they are also the terminal point for the ultimate synthesis of vitamin D. Remember, vitamin D begins by UV sunlight radiation on the skin, goes to the liver, and then it makes its way to the kidneys, where it finally turns into a hormone specifically that's produced from this vitamin D derivative called calcitriol. And calcitriol is the hormone that basically promotes calcium absorption from the digestive system. So, like, for instance, if you're eating calcium, this will allow you to be able to absorb it better, so you can get that calcium into your bloodstream. So let's go ahead and take a look at the structure, right? So when you take a look at the kidneys and the urinary system itself, obviously you're going to have the kidneys as a main component of the urinary system. It's going to be connected to the bladder by ureters. So the bladder is basically going to hold your urine. And then from the bladder, you're going to have your elimination tube, which is the urethra, and that basically exits the urine outside the body. You have two kidneys. You have one on each side, partially protected by the rib cage, not completely. Now, if you take a look at your kidneys itself, typically the right kidney is a little lower than the left, and that's because the liver is in the way, kind of getting in the way there. But it looks like a kidney bean. I mean, we call it a kidney bean for a reason. It looks like a kidney bean, kind of reddish brown in color. And it's covered by a renal capsule, which is basically a connective tissue husk. That allows it to bind to the serous membranes associated with your peritoneum. So the concave side of the kidney is basically where the inlet is. So this is what's called the hilum. And so you have your renal artery entering in this concave area. Also, the renal vein is in this area, and your ureters are in this area. So it's an entrance and an exit. So your renal artery will basically be taking blood into the kidneys for filtering, and the renal vein will be taking the blood back out of the kidneys that have been cleaned up and then sending it back to the heart itself. So here's kind of what it looks like. So here you can see your bean-shaped kidney here with your adrenal glands on top. You can see your renal artery going into the kidneys and your renal vein coming out of the kidneys. From this area, from the hilum, you also see your ureters, which are basically these long tubular-like structures that will then lead to the bladder. And then from there, you'll have the urethra. So that'll be the urethra outside the body. Okay, let's take a look at the ureters, right? So the ureter's job is very simple. It's basically to conduct the urine. It's a passageway to conduct the urine going from the kidneys to be stored in the bladder. So the wall of the ureter typically has three layers, right? So there's like an intermucosal layer. There's a smooth muscle layer. And then there's an outer fibrous layer, very similar, kind of the same sort of pattern that we've seen for a lot of tubular systems. Like, for instance, the blood vessels had a similar type of an inner sort of layer, a muscular layer and a fibrous layer. So did the GI tract. So it's very common kind of a pattern we see. Now, the smooth muscle will undergo what's called peristaltic contractions. Yeah, this may sound familiar, right? Because this is basically a similar contraction. Similar contraction pattern to what we see in the GI tract. Well, in this case, instead of pushing a food bolus around, it's pushing the urine basically down the ureter and then eventually into the bladder. Very similar to the way your esophagus squeezes the food bolus from your esophagus into the stomach itself. Once you're in the bladder, basically you have a nice little pouch that stores the urine. There's three main openings, right? There's two for the ureters from right and left kidney, and there's one leaving for the urethra, which drains the bladder to the outside world. Now, the folds in the mucosa are called rugae, very similar to what we saw, the same term being used for the folds of the mucosa in the stomach. So you can see there's a lot of sort of pattern overlap between some of these terms. So they disappear, however, as the bladder enlarges and it stretches out. This is also where we see transitional epithelium, which is that stretchy epithelium that looks kind of more ovoid in nature when it's relaxed, and when it's distended, it looks more squamous in nature. So the small folds of the bladder basically will act as a valve, and this will basically prevent backward flow so that your urine doesn't go back into the ureter. That's because of these folds, so it kind of covers that access point. And then there are two sphincters where the urethra is. The internal sphincter is smooth muscle, but this is one that is involuntarily controlled. However, there's an external sphincter. This one is skeletal muscle, and this one is voluntarily controlled. So basically, your external sphincter is, this is how we hold our bladder. So when we have to go to the bathroom, when we have to go pee, we can basically contract our external sphincter. That's going to close down on the ureter and keep the urine from passing through. When we're ready to urinate, then we relax that external sphincter. The internal sphincter is already ready to open up because of the pressure being exerted in the bladder. So all you have to do is just get out of the way. That's the skeletal muscle. Just let it go, and the internal sphincter already is ready to go. So this is kind of what it looks like. So your internal sphincter, which is right at the opening of the urethra, is going to be mostly under the control of the parasympathetic or the involuntary nerve fibers, which you can see here going to the spinal cord. And so this is the relay system. So basically it kind of goes through this area. It goes, wraps around the bladder, the musculature wraps around the bladder, and then communicates to those internal sphincters. However, the spinal cord is what's called somatic. It's part of the somatic nervous system. We'll talk more about that later. This is essentially what's controlling your skeletal muscles. So you can actually use your brain and say, hold it, hold it, hold it. And then what happens is the skeletal muscles will contract, cinching it off. So the urine will get through a little bit, but then it'll be stopped at the external sphincter until you're ready to go to the bathroom, in which case your brain says, okay, relax the sphincter, and then it allows passage of the urine. So then urination, which is micturition, is basically where the bladder fills with urine, and then you have stretch receptors in the bladder that are activated. And stretch receptors are a special type of mechanical receptors. They basically will sense physical mechanical distortion. And so if something's expanding, these stretch receptors will feel that physical distortion, and then they'll communicate that you are stretched out. And so these receptors, once they stretch out, will sense that stretch. They'll send those signals to the spinal cord. And then what happens is, from there, motor nerves from the spinal cord will cause the urinary bladder to contract, that musculature around the urinary bladder to contract, and it'll also tell the sphincters to relax so that the urine is able to pass through. And so the brain then, through the somatic system, has control over this too by controlling those external sphincters. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the urethra. So basically this is going to be going from the bladder to the external opening. And so it's a short length in females, In males, it has to go all the way through the length of the penis to the end. And this is part of the reason why, generally speaking, women have more susceptible to urinary tract infections and things like that, because it's kind of in there right by the reproductive organs. And if there is an infection, like a yeast infection or something like that, then it can kind of spread into the urinary system and things of that nature. Whereas in the males, the urethra is kind of away from the body a little bit. But generally speaking, it will essentially leave the bladder and it'll pass through the prostate gland. And then the prostate, if it enlarges, will actually cinch down on the urea, creating a sense of urgency, but you won't actually be able to urinate. So because it's being cinched or pinched down. So in females, the important thing to understand is even though the opening to the urinary system, the urethra, is close to the opening of the reproductive system, the vagina, they are not connected to each other. They're separate systems. They just happen to be, at least in this particular piece of the urinary system, next to each other as they exit the body. The males, however, their urethra is connected to the reproductive system. So essentially, the sperm delivery is through the same urethra that the urine is delivered through. So that is connected in males. Okay. Now let's take a look at some of the regions of the kidneys. So the kidneys are organized in an outer layer called the cortex. So this basically will be an outer region. By the way, cortex and medulla, these are just terminal things. Cortex is anything that's on the outside, medulla is in the middle. It also has a renal medulla in the center portion. And in this, you have the tissue organized into these cone-like structures called renal pyramids. And then as you start to move further inward, you'll run into the renal pelvis, which is a central space that is basically drained like a big funnel that drains urine into the ureter itself. So this is kind of what it looks like. So here you can see you have your cortical region at the top. So this is your cortex. And then the middle region, this is going to be your medulla. And then, of course, you can see these triangular shaped structures. These are the renal pyramids. And then this large open space here, you can see it looks like a giant funnel that basically gets more restricted as you lead into the ureter. This is your renal pelvis. Okay. So then the important thing is when you're making and filtering blood, and by the way, one thing I also want to point out is notice how the renal artery and the renal veins come in. They go up and they wrap themselves around these renal pyramids. And then there's little pieces of them that are kind of shooting up into the renal cortex as well. So that's an important vasculature type of organization. Because when we take a look at the kidneys in terms of their role of filtering blood, the most important functional, physiological function structure of the kidneys is what's called the nephron. The nephrons are actually the structure in the kidneys that produce the urine. These are the ones that are actually doing the work. And so generally speaking, you have lots of nephrons that will then basically make the urine, and then they'll dump that into what's called a collecting duct. And from the collecting duct, it'll go into the renal pelvis, where it'll be headed toward elimination. So this is kind of what it looks like. So you can see how these blood vessels, called arcuate veins and arteries, here are kind of on the leading edge, the upper edge of the cortex and the medulla. And then what happens is they branch off, and then from here, they basically form the vasculature that will basically be going through this whole nephron system. And so when you take a look at it, this piece right here is an important piece. We'll talk more about the tubular system here in just a second, but you can see this is like a giant capillary, and it's basically sort of wrapped around by all these blood vessels, these tubular systems, which is a tubular system, the nephron is, that's wrapped around by these capillary type structures. So let's go ahead and take, first of all, the entrance to the nephron. From the renal artery, they'll break into smaller and smaller arteries, like the arcuate artery, and then it'll move up, and then eventually what goes into the nephron is what's called the afferent arteriole, and I remember this because A is for arrival. This is your arrival arteriole. It moves into a giant capillary bed, a modified capillary bed called a glomerulus. It's a knot of capillaries that's inside a capsule, which is the beginning of the tubular nephron structure. And then coming out of it is the efferent arteriole. I remember this because E stands for exit. And this carries blood away from the glomerulus toward the main circulation. Generally speaking, your blood pressure in the glomerulus is higher than anywhere else in the body. And there's a reason for that. Because the efferent arteriole is narrower than the afferent. So basically what this does is it basically kind of bottles up the blood flow in the arteriole, creating higher pressure. We need to create that higher pressure because basically what's happening is we're creating a filtration membrane. It's like a sieve. And so we're pushing the blood against this filtration membrane to basically get all of the waste and stuff like that to kind of filter out. And so we need a little bit of push. We need a little bit of a strong blood pressure push in order to get that to happen. So the efferent arteriole will then make its way into a capillary network called the peri, which means around the tubular capillary network. And this surrounds the rest of the nephron. So this is basically what all of this piece here was in the nephron. These purple capillaries, this is your peritubular capillary. So the blood then goes into the venule from here, and then it'll be carried off to the rest of the body. So that's kind of what it looks like. So here, basically, you have the entrance. So here's your afferent arteriole that leads in. This is your glomerulus, this like little knotted mess of capillaries. That's where your sieve is, and this is actually what it looks like. So this is an actual glomerulus, what it looks like under microscopy. And then the blood's going to filter through there, and it's going to exit through the efferent arteriole, and then it's going to go through this peritubular capillary situation. The stuff that actually gets pushed out into the capsular tubule then becomes what will eventually become the urine. Now, there's a couple of different pieces that you can see here of this tubular system. It's broken up into proximal regions. So basically, you have your proximal convoluted tubule here, which is the PCT. And then you have your loop of Henle, which is down here. This is basically a nephron loop, or the loop of Henle. And then beyond that, you have another big chunk here. This one is the distal convoluted tubule, or the DCT. And then this guy right here is going to be the collecting duct. And so those are the main parts of the nephron structure. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to basically work our way through that entire tubular system. Let's start off, first of all, with the capsule. So this is the first part of the nephron. It's the outer layer, essentially, is mostly squamous epithelial cells. The inner layer is formed by what's called podocytes. So this actually means foot cell, is what this means. And what these do is they basically lay on top of the glomerulus, and they leave little pores that allows molecules that are big enough from the blood to basically go from the glomerulus into the glomerular capsule. So this basically creates the sieve. And it creates what we call in AMP the filtration membrane. From the glomerular capsule now, you're going to have fluid that's inside the capsular space, this fluid will essentially be what will become the urine. But from there, the next stop is going to be the proximal convoluted tubule. Typically, this is made out of cuboidal epithelial cells. They have microvilli on it to increase their surface area, but the job of the proximal convoluted tubule is to kind of reabsorb stuff. So here's kind of what the proximal convoluted tubule looks like. So it's cross section. So you can see this kind of large, kind of cuboidal looking cell here. And then you can see these little hairs right here. Those are the microvilli. And then inside is basically what we refer to as the filtrate. That is what's going to become the urine once everything is picked and chosen. Now from there, you're going to go to the loop of Henle, or the nephron loop, where you have a descending limb and then you have an ascending limb. And they have different permeabilities to water and solutes, and that's critical in its function. From the loop of Henle, you're going to go to the distal convoluted tubule, where its primary function is going to be ion exchange, essentially exchanging ions between the blood and the renal tubule. This then will dump its contents into the collecting duct, which then will carry it to the renal pelvis for elimination. So the glomerular capsule and the convoluted tubules basically are within the renal cortex. So that's what that is. The loop of Henle dips down into the renal medulla. And the collecting ducts are also in the renal medulla, and they go all the way to the tips of the pyramids. That's what gives them their striped appearance. Okay, now let's take a look at the process of urine formation. So first of all, when you take a look at urine formation, there's three main things that you always have to understand. First of all, the first step is filtration. We talked a little bit about that. We're going to get into the details of that. Then you have tubular reabsorption, and then of course, tubular secretion. So this is basically what we're looking at. So essentially what you have is filtration that's going on first in the glomerulus, where you're pushing solutes against that filtration membrane and creating a fluid-like filtrate in the capsular space. So here you can see what filtration looks like. As the blood pushes against the sieve-like membrane, the small stuff, things like urea and glucose, amino acids, uric acid, salts, are all going to, along with fluid, plasma, are all going to get pushed out into this capsular space. Bigger stuff gets stuck behind. So that's basically creating your filtrate. Then reabsorption is oftentimes going to be where you're going to be taking stuff back. For instance, the filtrate that you've created in the capsular space is still mostly plasma. It's not quite urine just yet. So you're going to go through a process of taking some stuff back and adding some extra stuff in there. So when you take it back, that's reabsorption. So you basically hang on to it. And then when you are getting rid of it, that's secretion. So the blue part is secretion. That's basically when you're dumping into the filtrate for elimination. And so let's go ahead and take a look at glomerular filtration. Basically, what's going to happen is blood's going to go into the glomerulus, and the glomerulus is like a giant capillary. And so that the afferent arteriole is going to have a larger diameter, so the blood flow is going to be bringing the blood into the glomerulus. But because the efferent arteriole has a smaller diameter, the blood pressure is going to be increased in this particular area. This creates a push against the filtration membrane. And this will allow for you to basically filter out those molecules with the glomerulus. The glomerulus is acting like a big filtration system. So then once you actually get this fluid, it's called the filtrate, the glomerular filtrate. It enters into the glomerular capsule. And basically here in this figure, this is kind of a raw, crude filtrate. Remember, like I said, it's not urine yet. So you're going to have large molecules in here that you don't want to urinate out. You're going to have formed elements in here that you don't want to urinate out. you're gonna have different other things in here as well that you don't want to urinate in. So some of these things you're going to want to take back. And so there will be some filterable components and some non-filterable components. So some filterable components that filter through are things like water, nitrogenous waste, nutrients, and salts. So that all gets into the filtrate. Some non-filterable things are the big stuff. So blood cells, for instance, platelets, plasma proteins. None of those are filterable because they're just too big. And so if they don't filter out, then basically they exit by way of the efferent arteriole. And then so ultimately the filtrate should be pretty much the same as your blood plasma. So at this point, your filtrate looks mostly like plasma, your blood plasma, not like urine. So you have to do a couple of additions and subtractions in order to get this thing to start resembling more what you'd expect from urine. So when you're taking a look at reabsorption, because that's the next step, right? So now you've created your raw filtrate. Now you got to start taking some stuff back and adding some stuff there. That's secretion. So basically, when you take a look at how much filtration you're going through, you're filtering probably something on the order of 180 per day. So these are, I believe, liters per day. So you're filtering 180 liters per day. But the amount that you're excreting is a very small percentage of that. It's like 100th of that. You're only excreting maybe 2 liters a day. So you're reabsorbing the lion's share of your water. You're also the same thing with sodium. You're reabsorbing the lion's share of your sodium. The glucose that gets in the filtrate, you're taking all of that back. The urea, you actually do reabsorb a little bit of that back, 44%, but most of it you're getting rid of. And so you kind of have to pick and choose. And let's take a look at reabsorption, right? So this is basically happening in the tubule system. So remember, from here, you're going to be moving into your proximal convoluted tubule. And so the molecules are basically going to be either passively or actively absorbed in the nephron, and they're going to go back into the blood by way of the peritubular capillary. So, for instance, sodium ion is actively transported by one of two ways. First of all, a symport. Oftentimes, you'll move sodium, and you'll couple that with the movement of other solutes, like, for instance, amino acids or glucose. So you'll bring glucose or amino acids in along with sodium. It also works as an antiporter. In this case, what happens is sodium comes in and something else goes out. And so oftentimes, for instance, you might dump your hydrogen ion out while sodium moves in. So sodium's going into the cell while the hydrogen ion goes out of the cell. This is how you regulate your pH. And this is also the reason why your urine is acidic. As sodium is moving, then you have to balance your charge, because remember, sodium has a positive charge. So you have to balance that out with a negative charge. And that basically means that chlorides follow passively. So essentially what you have ultimately is not just the reabsorption of sodium, but the reabsorption of sodium chloride. And so this increases in the blood compared to the filtrate. And therefore, when water is in the filtrate, what's going to happen is it's going to move passively by osmosis. Because remember, we said salt sucks. So if salt is going into your bloodstream, where's the water going to go? It's going to go back into the bloodstream. So about 2/3 of your sodium is reabsorbed at the proximal convoluted tubule. That's its job, reabsorb that sodium. Now, there are some nutrients such as glucose and amino acids that get into the filtrate, and you do not want to urinate these out because that is precious energy and building materials. You ate food. You ate a big meal for that. You did a lot of work for that. So you don't want to just let that go. So these guys are going to be reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. Usually glucose, all the glucose comes in. You don't usually have any glucose in your urine. And so you have a lot of different proteins that will basically shuttle that glucose in. So what happens if your blood glucose levels are just out of whack and you got way too much blood glucose levels? Well, that's where you get diabetes, right? So this is basically where you start to see glucose appearing in the urine. And this is the reason, because you have so much glucose that it overwhelms these glucose transporters. So you start to urinate out the excess. And so because you have excess glucose in your filtrate, it raises the osmolarity. By the way, you can think of osmolarity as the sucking effect of a salt. And this is the reason why this causes frequent urination, because you're getting rid of water. And since you're getting rid of water, you're going to be thirsty all the time. And so that's one of the symptoms of diabetes. Now let's take a look at tubular secretion. So tubular secretion, this is one way that, the second way. So we did the first way of moving substances, metabolic waste from the blood heading into the tubular fluid, but this is the second way. The first is filtration, right? So for instance, hydrogen ion can move in this way, creatinine can move in this way. Some drugs such as penicillin are secreted, they move in this way. This happens all the way throughout the kidney tubular system. And ultimately, then the urine will contain some things that have been filtered, some things that have not been reabsorbed, and some things that have been secreted or dumped into the urine stream to get rid of. Okay. So now let's take a look at the kidneys and homeostasis. So when you take a look at your urinary system, basically this is going to aid all systems because you're going to be getting rid of nitrogenous waste. You're going to be maintaining your water-salt balance, your acid-base balance. Also, your blood balance, cardiovascular system. You're going to be measuring and monitoring your acid-base balance in your cardiovascular system. Also, your blood pressure from your cardiovascular system. For your digestive system, you're going to have breakdown products, yellow pigments from the breakdown products of hemoglobin that as part of bile produced by the liver. This will allow you to basically absorb nutrients and ions and things of that nature. And then you can kind of maintain this in the kidneys. For the muscular system, you have ions that are necessary for contraction of muscles, like calcium, for instance. That's a big piece of the kidneys, right? The nervous system, the kidneys, basically, you need sodium in the blood in order to drive your nervous system. For the respiratory system, this is all working together with the urinary system for acid-base balance. The endocrine system, well, the hormones of the urinary system are actually endocrine system related. So the renin, the aldosterone, which comes from the adrenal glands, which is part of the endocrine system. There's ADH and other types of hormones that it works with as well. In the integument system, for instance, vitamin D, which basically leads to calcitriol, but you also have water balance, salt excretion, and some urea in your sweat glands. So they all work together. So when the liver produces urea, the muscles will make creatinine, which is your waste product, and then the cells of your body will make uric acid as they work on nucleic acids. These are then basically carried from the cardiovascular system to the kidneys by way of your blood, where you can excrete them. They get filtered out into the filtrate. You also have sweat glands, which your sweat is a mixture of water, salt, and some urea, and some ammonia at times. And so if you have kidney failure, basically your urea is going to start being secreted by the sweat more. And this will cause what's called uremic frost on the skin, which is a buildup of urea on the skin. Now, the water-salt balance, basically most of your water in the filtrate is reabsorbed. Most of it is into the blood. And that concentrates the urine, so you're not losing water. So parts of the nephron, for instance, the loop and the collecting duct will all be part of reabsorption of water. Why? Because you don't want to lose water. Or you'll dehydrate. And so basically you start with the reabsorption of water by reabsorption of salt. And then that will allow the water to chase the salt back into the body by osmosis. And so during reabsorption, water passes through specific channels called aquaporins. These are channels in the plasma membrane of cells that allows water safe passage. So pretty much water can move wherever it wants in response to the salt. So we saw before that 99% of the sodium filtered at the glomerulus is returned to the blood, indicating its importance. There's also other ions that the kidneys work on, for instance, potassium, bicarbonate, magnesium. And so there's a lot of different things going on at the kidney itself. Now, when you take a look at the reabsorption of salt and water from the cortical portions of the nephron, we said that almost 2/3 of the water that is filtered in the glomerulus is basically moved back into the blood. And that's going to be happening at the convoluted tubule. What happens basically is, remember, we said sodium is actively reabsorbed. It's actively transported back in, and then chloride follows passively. This is your salt buildup, right? Salt first. And then you have your salt sucks mantra. Then what happens is the water will basically flow through the aquaporins in response to that. So basically, you pile up your salt, you bring your salt into the blood, and then the water will move through the aquaporins, out of the tubular system, and into the bloodstream, where basically you want the water to be. There's also hormones that regulate this water movement. For instance, we talked a little bit about aldosterone, right, which is the one that was secreted by the adrenal glands. And what this actually does is it promotes the retention of sodium. So that's the job of aldosterone. So potassium ions are typically excreted. Sodium ions are reabsorbed into the blood. And the release of aldosterone basically is stimulating this retention of the sodium. And it's at the kidneys. It's actually in the collecting duct in the distal convoluted tubule that a lot of this is happening. Now, there's another structure that's associated with water balance that's important in the kidney structure itself. It's called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. This is a region in the nephron that is kind of an interaction between the afferent arteriole and the convoluted tubule. So what happens is the distal convoluted tubule actually kind of bends back on itself. So we kind of drew it sort of in kind of a linear form. So here's your capsule, here's your proximal convoluted tubule, your loop, your distal convoluted tubule, and your collecting duct. And what reality, the distal convoluted tubule actually bends backwards and kind of is in the front, sort of passes by the front end of the glomerulus. And when it does, this is a cross section of it. So you can see there's a little mash of cells right here in this region. And this mass of cells is the juxtaglomerular apparatus. It has two different pieces. One part of it is actually the distal convoluted tubule cells. These are what's called the macula densa cells. And then this little wedge of cells that are smashed in between the afferent arteriole and the distal convoluted tubule is what's called, these are called the juxtaglomerular cells. Together, they form the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Okay, so what do? So basically, when the blood volume is too low for filtration, the juxtaglomerular apparatus, actually the JG cells will sense that. And then the response is to secrete renin. Now remember, renin is an enzyme that ultimately leads to the secretion of aldosterone, which stimulates the retention of sodium in the blood, which allows osmotic flow of water into the blood. Okay. Basically how that system is working. Now, there's another hormone released by the pituitary called antidiuretic hormone, ADH. So without ADH, you can't actually reabsorb water. And typically you find this in the distal convoluted tubule. So it's produced by the hypothalamus, stored in the pituitary gland, and released by the pituitary gland under the direction of the kidneys. So what happens then is ADH will provides access. And it provides access for the water to respond to the sodium levels in the blood created by aldosterone. And so this will allow the water to move into the distal convoluted tubule, excuse me, out of the distal convoluted tubule and out of the collecting duct into the tissue and then ultimately into the bloodstream. Now, there's another one that also affects blood pressure, and these are all promorins affecting blood pressure, and that is atrionatriuretic peptide. So first of all, what I want to do is I want to take a look at this because we're looking at this really, what we're looking at is blood pressure homeostasis. And so what we just saw was what's called the peak response, or excuse me, the trough response. So at the trough, you have the entire renin, aldosterone, ADH response that increases blood pressure by bringing in water into the bloodstream. At the top, if your blood pressure gets too high, you have your ANH response. This is the atrial natriuretic hormone. And this is basically secreted by the atria of the heart. And it's typically sensed by stretch. So you have stretch receptors there because of the increased blood volume. Basically, if it's increased blood volume, that means your blood pressure is too high. And what it does is it basically inhibits the renin secretion and the aldosterone production. And it produces what's called natriuresis, which is the excretion of sodium. And so normally what happens is the salt gradient will then be moved into the filtrate, and then the water will chase the salt into the urine stream. So basically what this does is it dumps salt into the filtrate and water chases after. That gets rid of the water, bringing your blood pressure back down. So now when you take a look at the salt and water from the medullary portion of the nephron, then we start moving into the loop, the nephron loop, or the loop of Henle. So we have a descending limb and an ascending limb. So salt itself will passively diffuse out of the lower portion of the ascending limb. That's the one going up. The salt at the bottom and the inner medulla is greater, deeper into the medulla. What this does is it creates what I call an osmotic ladder. Zones where your concentration of salt increases and increases as you get deeper and deeper. The descending limb, as it plunges into this osmotic ladder, is experiencing this osmotic pull, the salt sucking. And so water will leave the descending limb all along its length, and it'll move into the capillary structure called the vasa recta. But it does this it descends by what's called a countercurrent mechanism. So they're going north and south, basically what they're doing. This increases exchange. The countercurrent system increases exchange efficiency. So then fluid within the descending limb encounters this increasing osmotic concentration as it goes further down. And then that's the way water leaves. And then the ascending limb does not reabsorb water. It lacks aquaporins, so there's no water movement there. And so what it'll do is basically it helps to establish this concentration gradient, this osmotic ladder. So the ascending creates the osmotic ladder that is necessary for the descending. And ultimately, water is returned to the cardiovascular system once it's resorbed. This is kind of what it looks like. So here's your loop. So this is basically, if you take a look at the solute concentration, this is going to be in zones, if you will, of concentration. For instance, you go from 300 milliosmoles, which is a measure of osmotic concentration, salt concentration. It gets saltier, 600 milliosmoles, then 900 milliosmoles as you get deeper, and then 1200 milliosmoles as you get deeper and deeper. So it gets saltier and saltier and saltier, and basically what that means is the salt is sucking the water out of the tubular system and into the tissue. Now, this black line represents impermeability to water. So this side here is impermeable, so water's not going to get through the ascending side. So the water stays in there, but what this ascending side, so as it goes down, this ascending side will then focus on pumping. There's sodium chloride pumps here that pump the salt into the tissue that maintains and creates this little salt gradient that is being used by the loop. So you're going this direction down in one side, on the other side you're going up. That's your counter current mechanism. So then ultimately, once we get to the collecting duct, the fluid encounters the same osmotic gradient that's established by the ascending loop. So basically, this guy here is also, here's your collecting duct over here. So this is also feeling the same salt concentration gradient. So it's going to be sucking water finally out of the collecting duct as it goes down, and it's heading toward the renal pelvis. So water will basically diffuse during the entire length of the collecting duct if ADH is present. So this is what creates permeability in the collecting duct. If you don't have ADH, then you're not going to get, the water's going to stay in the filtrate, and you're going to urinate out a large volume of urine. So diuresis basically means you have an increased amount of urine, and an antidiuresis means you have a decreased amount of urine. And so ADH increases water reabsorption. That allows the blood volume and the blood pressure to rise, and it also decreases urine volume. So now ANH, remember this is the atrionatriuretic peptide. Basically, if the blood pressure is too low, your exchange can't take place. So the pressure starts to crash. And so this will basically drop the blood pressure, but you can't go too low, right? So this, if you have an overactive ANH, it's going to dump that sodium into the urine stream, which means you're going to have a sodium level crash. You're going to decrease sodium levels. If your sodium levels get too low, like for instance, if you have a lot of sweating, you're getting rid of a lot of salts. So if your blood pressure falls, your renin-aldosterone sequence begins. If your kidneys increase sodium absorption, this will basically increase the amount of sodium. So all these different things can kind of happen when your sodium levels begin to fall. And of course, ANH is antagonistic to that. So basically, that's getting rid of more sodium levels. So generally speaking, if your sodium levels are crashing, then you're not likely going to be having an active ANH response. So once you kind of do some of these measures, basically, so sweating, your blood pressure falls, you get the renin-aldosterone sequence, that increasing absorption of sodium. Basically, the osmolarity of the blood will eventually return back to normal because you sort of stabilized your sodium levels. This is the reason why when you're active, an athlete, you don't drink too much water. Pure water can dilute the body's remaining sodium, so that causes a problem in the water salt balance. Is the reason why sports drinks like Gatorade have electrolytes in them, sodium in particular. And so, but they can have lots of calories in them, so they can have lots of sugar in them. So typically you don't want to use them unless you're really working out for a long period of time. So then sodium chloride is absorbed from your food. And so the sodium content of your blood will increase and they'll go above normal. And this will basically increase your blood volume. So if you're eating too much salt, which will create a stretch in the heart, and that will release your ANH by the heart, which will then dump the sodium or stimulate sodium secretion into the urine stream, and the water will chase it. And then ultimately, that'll decrease your blood volume, and your blood pressure will get back down to normal. So diuretics, basically, when you take a look at a diuretic, increases the flow of urine. And so, for instance, the alcohol is a diuretic. Basically, it inhibits the secretion of ADH, so it creates a larger volume of urine. Caffeine increases the rate of filtration and decreases your reabsorption of sodium, then creating a larger amount of water to be released. And so there's diuretic drugs for high blood pressure, for instance. If you need to get rid of fluids, it'll basically decrease your sodium reabsorption, and it'll decrease your water absorption, decrease the blood volume, and decrease your pressure. That's how it basically gets to your blood pressure. Now, when you're taking a look at acid-base maintenance, your physiological pH is right around 7.4. So this is kind of where things are. If we drop below that, it's acidosis. We become too acidic. If we go above that, it's alkalosis. It's too alkaline. And so a lot of the foods will add acidic substances or basic substances to the metabolism. And the pH of our body fluids will constantly fluctuate. And so we've got buffer systems to maintain those pHs. The carbonate buffer system, for instance, is one of them. Your respiratory center can get rid of the CO2. And of course, your kidneys can offload your hydrogen ions. So you have multiple different types of systems to maintain that pH. Now, the buffer, basically what a buffer is a molecule that essentially can take up excess hydrogen ion, which is what causes the acidity, or the excess hydroxide ion, which is what causes the base. And in addition to this, what this does in return is it basically maintains a constant stable pH. So one of the most important buffers is our carbonate buffer system, which I think we're going to be seeing here in just a second. So here it is. So ultimately, what's going to happen is in our acid-base buffer system, which I'm going to see here. So we have, and I think we saw this before earlier on, right? So you basically take a water with a CO2. We saw this in the respiratory chapter, just to remind you. And that's going to make carbonic acid, which will then dissociate into hydrogen ion plus bicarb. But remember, these are reversible. So when your hydrogen enters your bloodstream, basically it looks something like this. You're adding pieces here. So you're adding the acidity to it. So ultimately, this will basically be gobbled up by the bicarb ions, and it'll be basically neutral. So it's non-acidic. So it'll be moved into this sort of neutral carbonic acid state. Okay, so you essentially neutralize it. Now, if you add a hydroxide ion to you, basically that's going to interact with the carbonate ion, creating bicarb and water. So, but this neutralizes or eliminates that hydroxide ion, therefore maintaining your pH. And that's the whole point of a buffer. So our blood buffer, which is basically given down here, reverse reaction, it can be overwhelmed, right? So basically, to keep your pH the same, if you can't this is, by the way, what we just looked at here. This is the buffer maintenance. Of pH. Now, if the buffer gets overwhelmed, then basically we have to start employing our respiratory system. So essentially what's going to happen is with an increase in hydrogen ion, it's going to push these reactions to the right, liberating CO2, which we can then breathe out. And then once we breathe that out, we get rid of the CO2, and that brings the acidity back down. The alternative one then is also that the kidneys, right? So for instance, if we have an excess of hydrogen ion, this hydrogen ion can be combined with ammonia to create ammonium, and then this can be excreted. But that's one way to get rid of hydrogen ion. So we can also get rid of the bicarb as well. But ammonia, since we're constantly producing ammonia through our metabolism, is a really helpful way of buffering and getting rid of that extra hydrogen ion. So this is kind of what it looks like, our pH management in the kidneys. So you can see you have your blood pH here. If this gets too high, then we can just basically move that hydrogen ion into the kidney tubule where it'll interact with the ammonia and turn into ammonium, which is also very water soluble, and so it's easily urinated out. And then in order to balance that, we basically can move the bicarb from our tubular system into our bloodstream to make sure that everything is balanced. So the kidneys are assistants, however, in other things as well. For instance, we mentioned earlier that they secrete erythropoietin, which is essentially the hormone that drives the production of red blood cells in the bone marrow. They can also help to regulate calcium by its interactions with vitamin D. So it basically creates from vitamin D the hormone calcitriol, which will allow you to act as a co-absorbent in the digestive system so that you can absorb calcium. And then once you absorb calcium, then you can essentially pack that calcium into your bones and use it for muscle contraction and things of that nature. And so this will also help in the kidneys to regulate excretion of different types of things. So the kidneys will also regulate sodium and potassium. And so this is necessary for nerve conduction, for muscle contraction of the heart and the muscles of the body and things of that nature. So it really does help with a lot of different things. The kidneys kind of cut a wide swath and help in a lot of different things. Let's take a look at some disorders and we'll wrap this chapter up. So there's a lot of different types of things that can happen, especially diabetes, for instance, hypertension, things of that nature, renal disease that can happen to the renal system. You have urethritis, which is essentially an infection of the urethra, cystitis, which is an infection of the urinary bladder, and then pyelonephritis is an infection of the kidney itself. Pyelonephritis, nephritis is basically an inflammation or an infection of the nephrons themselves. So you're looking at the actual kidney tissue itself. So urinary tract infections can occur. That's basically bacterial infection of the urinary tract at some point. You can have an enlarged prostate, which will start to pinch down on the urethra. pH imbalances can cause issues because they can create kidney stones, because changes in pH can cause things like calcium to start nucleating and start precipitating out, and they'll start to form hard granules made out of calcium and phosphate, uric acid, protein, and then they'll basically form stones. Oftentimes in the renal pelvis, because there's a large opening, you don't feel them, but once they pass um, into the ureter, this is where they can block that ureter, that opening, and it creates a lot of pressure and it can destroy nephrons by backing up the system and things like that. So typically when you take a look at nephron damage, one of the first signs of nephron damage is the buildup of albumin, which is a plasma protein. Remember we said before that this is supposed to be unfilterable. So if it's in your urine, that means that you've blown a hole in your filtration membrane. Same thing with white blood cells, even red blood cells, blood in the urine. Basically means that you've blown holes in your nephron. And that basically means they're damaged. They're not able to filtrate out the urine if you've blown big holes in them. And so you can usually pick this up with a nice test strip, just a basic urinalysis with a nice test strip. Uremia, remember we said, is the accumulation of urea and other waste in the blood. This is oftentimes a backup because of kidney damage. And so you have to have a pretty decent amount of nephron damage, though, in order for that to back up, because your nephrons are pretty good at what they do. So the nitrogenous wastes are serious types of molecules. You don't want them to linger. They can cause a lot of damage, but you can also foul up your water salt balance with backing up your nitrogenous base. So for instance, edema is basically the collection or the buildup of fluid in tissue. And that's usually because of some sort of a water balance imbalance going on. So water's not moving the way it should. There's an abnormal ion balance, and so this could be a problem. You also have hemodialysis, basically, which is like a response to damaged kidneys. So this is basically you have an artificial kidney machine, a continuous ambulatory peritoneal dialysis, where you basically filter fluids through the peritoneal liner, and that's one way of kind of screening the blood. You also have dialysis. So you diffuse the dissolved molecules through a semi-permeable membrane that has pore sizes that only allows small things to pass. So basically a machine is acting like the filtration membrane because your nephrons are shot. And so that's like what dialysis does. And of course you have your artificial kidney machine, where your actual the machine is doing the membranous selection. And you have to have dialysis solution that kind of moves that fluid through the machine. It screens or filters the blood and then basically replaces the blood back into the individual. Generally speaking, the substances that are in high concentration will usually diffuse into the dialysate, which is the dialysis fluid. And then the substances that are the more concentrated in the dialysate will diffuse back into the blood. So this is kind of like essentially your proxy for absorption, reabsorption, and secretion. That's basically what's happening here. So you can either do this to exchange or extract things from the blood, waste products, toxic chemicals, drugs, things like that. Usually, if you're doing this kind of approach, you're talking about a 3 to 6 hour, twice a week kind of a situation. So it becomes a very difficult management thing. The CAPD, right, the peritoneum dialysis, this is basically where the dialysate is introduced directly into the abdominal cavity. And then the waste and the salt molecules of the blood vessels will basically pass through the abdominal wall, through the peritoneum, into the dialysate before the fluid is collected about 4 to 8 hours later. So basically, you're kind of filtering this through the peritoneal liner. So the one good thing about this is that typically an individual can have kind of a normal activity. They're not hooked up to a machine. This is just something where it's being filtered through their own peritoneum. Then, of course, if you have total renal failure, you can start talking about transplant operations. but you also have to deal with tissue rejection. And the current 1-year survival rate for a kidney transplant is a pretty good one. It's about 97% or in the 90s, whether it's from a relative or a non-relative. So that's actually a pretty good prognosis for a kidney replacement. And so that is the end of chapter 11.